Observer Keleth sat in his command chair aboard the Silent Witness, staring at the mission briefing that glowed on his screen. 300 years. That's how long he had been doing this job. 300 years of watching species tear each other apart in the cold darkness of space. He thought he had seen everything. He thought nothing could surprise him anymore. He was wrong. The assignment seemed simple enough. The Galactic Council needed someone to document the conflict between humanity and the Vraxian horde. Keleth was the obvious choice. He had documented wars across more than 100 worlds. His reports filled entire libraries. Young observers studied his work to learn the craft. He was, without question, the best at what he did. Keleth read through the files on both species. The Vraxians were well known to him. Insectoid creatures that moved as one mind. They had terrorized the outer colonies for generations. Their ships were fast and deadly. Their warriors felt no fear because they shared a collective consciousness. Losing individual soldiers meant nothing to them. They were efficient killers, and Keleth had watched them crush dozens of species over the years. Then there were the humans. Keleth pulled up their files with mild curiosity. They were newcomers to the galactic stage, having achieved faster-than-light travel only 20 years ago. Their technology was primitive compared to most species. Their ships were built with materials that other civilizations had abandoned centuries ago. They had no natural weapons, no armored skin, no telepathic abilities. They were soft creatures from a world they called Earth. The Council's notes were brief. Humans had established a small colony on a planet called New Haven. The Vraxians wanted it. A human fleet was being sent to defend it. The outcome seemed obvious to everyone. The Vraxians would win, the humans would retreat or die, and the colony would fall. Keleth's job was simply to record it all for the archives. He piloted the Silent Witness to the New Haven system and positioned his ship at a safe distance. His vessel was equipped with the finest scanning technology in the galaxy. He could observe from millions of kilometers away and capture every detail. The battles he documented were like watching ants fight from the top of a mountain. Safe, clinical, professional. Keleth checked his equipment one final time. Everything was functioning perfectly. His recording arrays were online. His backup systems were ready. He poured himself a cup of his favorite beverage and settled into his chair. In a few hours, the battle would begin. In a few more hours, it would be over. Tomorrow, he would begin writing his report. The human fleet arrived first. Keleth's sensors counted 5 ships. He zoomed in to examine them more closely. The largest was a carrier vessel. His database identified it as the Defiant, commanded by someone named Captain Jake Morrison. The other 4 ships were smaller, a mix of cruisers, destroyers, and frigates. All of them looked old and patched together, like they had seen better days. Keleth did a quick calculation. 5 ships, maybe 2,000 personnel total. Their weaponry was outdated. Their armor was thin. Their shields were weak compared to modern standards. He shook his head slowly. These humans were brave, he supposed, but bravery wouldn't save them from what was coming. He pulled up Captain Morrison's file. The human was 42 years old, which Keleth understood was relatively young for their species. Morrison had served in Earth's Space Navy for 18 years. He had won several medals for valor. His record showed multiple commendations for leadership under pressure. The file included a photo. Morrison had short dark hair, serious eyes, and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from stone. Keleth read through the crew rosters of all 5 ships. Lieutenant Amy Price commanded a destroyer called the Relentless. Commander Lisa Banks was a fighter pilot with an impressive record. Sergeant Danny Cross led a Marine unit. Engineer Pete Collins had served on the Defiant for a decade. The list went on, names and faces of people who would likely be dead by the end of the day. The observer felt a twinge of something he hadn't experienced in decades. Was it pity? He pushed it aside. Emotion had no place in his work. He was a witness, nothing more. His job was to record facts, not to care about the beings who created those facts. An alert chimed on his console. Keleth's sensors had detected the Vraxian fleet emerging from hyperspace. He directed his cameras toward them and felt his stomach tighten. 47 ships. The Vraxians had brought 47 warships to fight 5 human vessels. This wasn't going to be a battle. It was going to be an execution. The Vraxian ships formed into their standard attack formation, a swarm pattern that had proven effective against countless enemies. They moved with perfect coordination, every ship in exact position. Their weapons powered up simultaneously, creating a light show of deadly energy across Keleth's screens. Keleth expected the human ships to turn and run. Any sane species would retreat when facing such impossible odds. He had seen it happen 1,000 times before. There was no shame in survival. The humans could leave, regroup, and return with reinforcements. That was the logical choice. But the human ships didn't move. Captain Morrison's voice suddenly crackled across all communication frequencies. Keleth's universal translator converted the words into something he could understand. The captain's tone was calm and steady, like he was ordering breakfast instead of facing certain death. All hands, battle stations, let's show them what we're made of. Keleth leaned forward in his chair. What were they doing? Surely they could see the odds. Surely they understood that staying meant dying. His centuries of experience told him this was wrong. Species didn't behave this way. When faced with overwhelming force, they retreated. It was the most basic survival instinct in the universe. The human ships began to move. But they weren't running away. They were accelerating forward, directly toward the Vraxian fleet. All 5 ships, their engines burning bright, charging straight into the jaws of death. Keleth's hand trembled as he adjusted his recording equipment. Something was happening here, something he had never seen before. In 300 years of watching wars, he had never seen anyone do what these humans were about to do. He whispered to himself in his own language, a prayer that hadn't crossed his lips in decades. Then he began to record. Whatever happened next, the galaxy needed to see it. The galaxy needed to know about these humans and their impossible courage. The distance between the fleets shrank rapidly. Weapons charged, targeting systems locked. In seconds, the first shots would be fired. Keleth held his breath, unable to look away from his screens. He had thought this would be routine work. Just another entry in the archives. Just another forgotten battle in the endless cycle of galactic warfare. He had been so certain that nothing could surprise him anymore. He had never been more wrong about anything in his entire long life. And somewhere deep inside, beneath his professional detachment, a voice whispered a warning he couldn't quite hear. A warning that said watching humans fight was going to change him in ways he couldn't imagine. Ways he would regret for the rest of his days. The first weapons fired, and Keleth's entire understanding of warfare shattered like glass. The human ships didn't spread out into a defensive formation. They didn't try to use the asteroid field for cover. They didn't attempt any of the standard tactics that Keleth had seen 1,000,000 times before. Instead, they flew straight into the center of the Vraxian swarm like bullets shot from a gun. The Defiant led the charge, its weapons blazing in all directions. Captain Morrison's voice came through the communication channels, calm and clear. All ships follow my lead. Pick your targets and make every shot count. Keleth watched as the destroyer Relentless broke away from the formation. Lieutenant Amy Price pushed her ship's engines to maximum power. The destroyer wasn't running away. It was moving faster, harder, directly at a Vraxian cruiser that was 3 times its size. Keleth's sensors screamed warnings about collision courses and suicide runs. Price ignored them all. The Relentless slammed through the Vraxian cruiser's shields like they were paper. The destroyer's nose crashed into the enemy hull, metal screaming against metal. For a moment, Keleth thought Price had actually rammed the enemy ship. Then he saw her weapons firing at point-blank range, pouring energy directly into the Vraxian vessel's interior. The cruiser exploded from the inside and the Relentless pulled away at the last possible second, its hull glowing red from the heat. Keleth's hands shook as he recorded the data. No one fought like this. No one deliberately flew their ship into weapons range when they could fire from a distance. It was insane. It was reckless. It was working. The Vraxian formation began to collapse. Their swarm tactics depended on coordination and distance. The humans had eliminated distance completely. They were fighting in close, so close that the Vraxians couldn't use their numerical advantage. Every enemy ship that tried to target a human vessel risked hitting their own allies. Then Keleth saw something that made his blood run cold. One of the Vraxian command ships had been crippled by the Defiance opening barrage. It was still functional but unable to maneuver effectively. Any reasonable military force would destroy it from a distance and move on to the next target. The humans did not do this. Sergeant Danny Cross led a boarding party of 20 Marines directly onto the Vraxian ship. Kelleth watched through the human helmet cameras as Cross and his team cut through the enemy hull with plasma torches. They jumped into the breach wearing nothing but basic armor and carrying weapons that looked ancient compared to Vraxian technology. The fighting inside the ship was brutal and close. Vraxian warriors were twice the size of humans, with natural armor and blade-like limbs that could cut through steel. They had every advantage in close combat, but Cross and his Marines fought like demons. When one Marine ran out of ammunition, he used his weapon as a club. When another Marine's weapon jammed, she pulled out a knife and kept fighting. Kelleth had documented thousands of boarding actions in his career. They were usually careful, methodical operations. Teams would clear each room slowly, using drones and scanners to minimize casualties. The humans didn't have time for that. They ran through the corridors like a flood, overwhelming the Vraxians with pure aggression. Cross led from the front, his voice shouting orders and encouragement even as enemy blades cut into his armor. Outside the crippled ship, the space battle continued. Commander Lisa Banks flew her fighter craft through the Vraxian formations, like a needle threading through cloth. Kelleth's sensors detected something alarming. Banks had disabled her ship's safety systems. Her engines were running at 140% capacity, far beyond their design limits. The fighter's hull was beginning to crack from the stress. Banks used the extra speed to destroy 3 Vraxian interceptors in less than a minute. Her weapon's fire was precise and deadly, but her ship was dying around her. Kelleth could see the structural damage spreading across the fighter's frame. Any second now, the craft would tear itself apart. A warning must have appeared on Banks's display. Kelleth knew most pilots would eject at this point. They would abandon the failing craft and trust their emergency systems to keep them alive until rescue. Banks did not eject. She aimed her disintegrating fighter at a 4th Vraxian interceptor and hit her boosters one final time. The collision was spectacular. Both ships exploded in a ball of fire that lit up Kelleth's screens. For a moment he hoped that Banks had somehow survived. Then his sensors confirmed what he already knew. There were no life signs. Commander Lisa Banks had turned herself into a weapon and taken an enemy with her. Kelleth wanted to stop recording. He wanted to close his eyes and pretend he hadn't seen that. But his training held. His fingers kept working, adjusting cameras and sensors, capturing every terrible moment. This was his job. This was what he did. Even when it broke his heart. An hour into the battle, 2 human ships were gone. The carrier Horizon had been torn apart by concentrated Vraxian fire. The frigate Steadfast had taken a direct hit to its reactor and vanished in a silent explosion. 3 human ships remained against more than 30 Vraxian vessels. The mathematics of war said the humans should surrender now. Mathematics didn't account for human stubbornness. The Defiant was badly damaged. Kelleth's sensors showed multiple hull breaches, failing shields, and fires burning in at least 6 sections. Engineer Pete Collins was working in the engine room, trying to keep the ship functional. A plasma conduit had ruptured, spraying deadly energy across the compartment. Any sane engineer would have evacuated and sealed the room. Collins grabbed the broken conduit with his bare hands. Kelleth watched in horror as the engineer held the pieces together, his gloves melting, his skin burning. Collins screamed but didn't let go. He held that conduit together while Lieutenant Sophie Turner worked frantically to reroute the power. It took 90 seconds. 90 seconds of Collins burning while he kept his ship alive. When Turner finally shut down the conduit, Collins collapsed. Medical teams rushed him to the infirmary, but he had already done what needed to be done. The Defiance engines were still running. The ship could still fight. Kelleth felt sick. He had watched species die in every way imaginable. He had seen soldiers burned, crushed, frozen, and torn apart, but he had never seen someone deliberately burn themselves to save others. The humans did it without hesitation, like it was the most natural thing in the world. The Vraxians were learning to fear these creatures. Kelleth could see it in their formation patterns. They were staying further back now, trying to use their range advantage. But the humans kept closing the distance, kept forcing the fight into close quarters where their insanity gave them an edge. Pilot Greg Hansen was flying a damaged fighter back to the Defiant when Vraxian fire hit his craft. The fighter spun out of control and crashed into the Defiant's hangar bay. Hansen's legs were crushed in the impact. Medical teams tried to reach him, but enemy boarding parties were attacking that section of the ship. Hansen couldn't walk. He could barely move, so he dragged himself inch by painful inch to a gun turret near the crash site. Kelleth watched through the security cameras as Hansen pulled himself into the gunner's seat. The pilot's legs hung uselessly below him, twisted at wrong angles, but his hands were steady on the controls. When the Vraxian boarding party tried to enter the hangar, Hansen opened fire. He held that position for 20 minutes, guarding the approach while damage control teams sealed the breaches behind him. This was wrong. This violated every principle of self-preservation that existed in the galaxy. Wounded soldiers were supposed to retreat and heal. They weren't supposed to drag broken bodies to weapons and keep fighting. But Hansen did it, and watching through the cameras. Kelleth knew the pilot would keep doing it until he either ran out of enemies or ran out of life. The second hour of battle began with 17 Vraxian ships destroyed and 3 human ships still fighting. The odds were still impossible. The humans were still doomed. But they had done something Kelleth didn't think was possible. They had made the Vraxians afraid, and fear, he was beginning to understand, could be just as powerful as any weapon. Captain Jake Morrison's hands moved across his command console with practiced ease. The Defiance reactor was going critical, and there was no way to stop it now. He had minutes at best. He could evacuate the remaining crew and let the ship explode harmlessly in space. That would be the reasonable choice. The safe choice. Morrison had never been good at playing it safe. Navigation. Plot a course directly through the center of the Vraxian formation, he ordered. Maximum speed. The navigator, a young officer named Paul Green, hesitated only for a second. Then his fingers flew across his controls. Course plotted, sir. Engine room confirms they can give us full power for approximately 3 minutes before complete reactor failure. That's all we need, Morrison said. He opened a ship-wide channel. This is the captain. Everyone still aboard has 30 seconds to reach an escape pod. That's an order. Move now. Kelleth watched as the remaining crew members looked at each other. They had all heard the order. They all understood what it meant. Morrison was going to turn the Defiant into a guided missile, and he was going to ride it all the way to the target. It was a suicide run, pure and simple. Engineer Pete Collins spoke up from the engine room, his voice rough from pain. Captain, someone needs to keep the engines balanced for maximum speed. I'm staying. Collins, get to a pod. That's a direct order. Sorry, sir. Can't hear you. Communications must be damaged. Collins's voice carried a hint of dark humor. Engines are go for your run. Make it count. One by one, other crew members reported in with similar excuses. Lieutenant Sophie Turner claimed her console was jammed. Gunnery Officer Victor Hayes said his weapon systems needed manual control. They were all lying. They all knew it. Morrison knew it too. The captain closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them again, Kelleth could see the weight of command in that gaze. Morrison was responsible for these people. Their deaths would be on his conscience for whatever brief time he had left. But he also knew that arguing would waste precious seconds. And these people had made their choice. Understood, Morrison said quietly. It's been an honor, everyone. Engage engines. All power to forward thrust. The Defiant lurched forward, its damaged engines screaming in protest. The carrier accelerated toward the Vraxian fleet at a speed that should have been impossible for a ship in such poor condition. But the humans weren't concerned with what should be possible. They were focused on what needed to happen. Lieutenant Chris Baker commanded the cruiser Horizon from his own damaged bridge. He watched the Defiant's course with growing understanding. Navigation matched the Defiant's trajectory. Full power, sir? His navigator asked, confusion evident in her voice. You heard me. We're going with them. The navigator's face went pale, but she followed orders. The Horizon turned and began to accelerate alongside the Defiant. Baker opened a communication channel to Morrison. Captain, the Horizon is with you. We're not letting you do this alone. On the Valiant, Commander Rachel Stone saw what the other 2 ships were doing. She looked at her bridge crew, saw the determination in their eyes, and made her decision. All hands brace for impact acceleration. We're joining the final attack. 3 human ships, all of them dying, all of them broken, formed a wedge formation and flew directly at the heart of the Vraxian fleet. Kelleth's sensors showed him something that seemed impossible. The humans were singing. As they rushed toward certain death as their ships fell apart around them, they were singing something the translator called a battle hymn. The Vraxians saw them coming. They tried to scatter, but they were too close together and moving too slowly. The human ships were simply too fast. too committed to their course. There was no time to escape. The Defiance reactor reached critical mass just as the carrier entered the center of the Vraxian formation. The explosion was massive, larger than any weapon the humans possessed. The blast consumed Morrison's ship instantly, vaporizing the Defiant and everyone aboard. 17 Vraxian vessels were caught in the explosion and destroyed. Another dozen were crippled by the shockwave. Their shields overloaded, their hulls cracked and broken. In that moment of chaos, the Horizon and Valiant struck like vengeful spirits. Victor Hayes, who had somehow survived the blast on the Defiance bridge, had transmitted the Vraxian shield frequencies to the other ships in his final seconds. Baker and Stone used that information to devastating effect. Their weapons found every weakness, every vulnerability in the enemy vessels. The Horizon, its hull glowing red from heat and damage, tore through 3 crippled Vraxian ships before its own reactor finally gave out. The ship went dark, drifting through space, but its weapons had done their job. Baker and his crew had avenged their captain and bought precious time for the colony below. The Valiant was the last human ship still fighting. Stone pushed her frigate to its absolute limits, dancing through the wreckage of 2 fleets. Her ship was faster than anything the Vraxians had, and she used every bit of that speed. The frigate twisted and turned, fired and dodged, fought like a cornered animal with nothing left to lose. But the battle wasn't over yet. On one of the crippled Vraxian ships, Corporal Tyler Jackson was leading the last surviving Marine squad. They had been aboard that ship since the early hours of the battle, fighting room by room, corridor by corridor. The explosion that killed Morrison had knocked them off their feet, but they were still alive. And they were very close to the Vraxian command center. Jackson counted his remaining Marines. Started with 20. Now he had 6. All of them were wounded. All of them were running on nothing but adrenaline and stubbornness. He looked at his squad and saw the same determination in their eyes that he felt in his chest. "We're almost there," he said. "One more push. For Morrison. For everyone we've lost. Let's finish this." They moved through the damaged ship using captured Vraxian weapons. Their own ammunition had run out hours ago. The enemy blades and guns were awkward in human hands, designed for creatures with different anatomy. But the Marines made them work. They had to. The Vraxian command center was heavily defended. Jackson's squad fought through 3 separate ambush points, losing 2 more Marines in the process. Marine Scott Davidson took a blade to the chest, protecting Jackson's back. Marine Amanda Price held off a counterattack while the others advanced and died doing it. They were down to 4 people when they finally breached the command center door. The Vraxian admiral was there, surrounded by guards and tactical officers. The chamber was large and filled with strange technology that Kelleth didn't recognize. Jackson and his 3 remaining Marines burst through the door with guns blazing. The guards died in seconds. The tactical officers tried to run. Jackson's team cut them down. The admiral was the last one standing. The creature was huge, easily 3 times Jackson's size, with natural armor that had deflected bullets. It roared a challenge in a language the human couldn't understand. Jackson responded by dropping his gun and pulling out a combat knife. What followed was brutal and short. The admiral was stronger and had natural weapons. Jackson was faster and absolutely unwilling to die before completing his mission. They fought hand to hand in the center of the command chamber. Kelleth recorded every second of it, watching in horror and fascination as the small human battled the massive alien. Jackson took wounds that should have killed him. A blade through his shoulder, another through his side. But he kept fighting, kept moving, kept pushing forward. He found a gap in the admiral's armor at the neck joint and drove his knife deep. The Vraxian admiral fell, and Jackson collapsed beside it. The remaining Vraxian ships detected their admiral's death. Their collective consciousness felt the loss like a physical blow. For the first time in the battle, their perfect coordination shattered. Ships broke formation. Orders conflicted with each other. Panic spread through their fleet like a disease. Commander Stone saw the chaos and struck without mercy. The Valiant's weapons found target after target. Vraxian ships that had been confident and aggressive now fled in disarray. Stone pursued them, destroying every vessel she could reach. Her weapons overheated and began to fail. She kept firing. Her shields collapsed under enemy return fire. She kept fighting. When the last Vraxian ship finally retreated into hyperspace, Stone's crew let out a ragged cheer. They had done it. Against impossible odds, against every prediction and calculation, they had won. The colony was safe. Humanity had held the line. Kelleth sat in his observation chair staring at his screens in stunned silence. The battlefield was full of wreckage. 5 human ships had entered the battle. Only the Valiant remained functional. Of the 2,000 humans who had fought, fewer than 400 survived. The cost had been terrible beyond measure, but they had won. These crazy, stubborn, beautiful humans had won, and Kelleth knew that nothing in his long life would ever be the same again. The Defiant was dying. Kelleth could see it in every sensor reading, every damage report that flashed across his screens. The carrier had taken hits from at least 30 different weapons. Fire burned in 12 sections. Half the crew was dead or wounded. The ship's reactor was becoming unstable. Any other vessel would have been abandoned an hour ago. Captain Jake Morrison stood on his bridge, blood running down the side of his face from a cut above his eye. He ignored it. His attention was focused on the tactical display in front of him. The remaining Vraxian ships were regrouping, preparing for a final assault. Morrison knew his ship wouldn't survive another attack. Everyone on the Defiant knew it. All non-essential personnel to the escape pods, Morrison ordered. His voice was tired but steady. Get to the colony. They'll need everyone they can get if we fail here. Kelleth watched as hundreds of humans began moving toward the escape pod bays. They moved quickly but without panic. Even now, facing certain death, they maintained their discipline. The observer had seen many species in their final moments. Some fought among themselves. Some froze in terror. Some begged their gods for mercy. The humans just did their jobs and prepared to die. But not everyone followed the evacuation order. Engineer Pete Collins, his hands wrapped in medical bandages from the burns, stayed at his post in the engine room. Lieutenant Sophie Turner remained at the power distribution station. Security Chief Henry Palmer kept his teams at their positions throughout the ship. Across the Defiant, dozens of crew members refused to leave. Morrison noticed. I gave you an order, he said over the ship-wide communication system. His voice carried an edge of anger now. With respect, sir, Collins replied from the engine room. Someone needs to keep this ship running, and that's my job. Mine too, Turner added. One by one, voices called in from across the ship. Medical Officer Karen Mills refused to leave her patients in the infirmary. Gunnery Officer Victor Hayes stayed at his weapons console. Communications Officer Linda Scott remained at her station. They all had reasons. They all had excuses. The truth was simpler and more terrifying. They weren't leaving because their captain wasn't leaving. Kelleth felt something crack inside his chest. 300 years of watching war, and he had never seen loyalty like this. These humans were choosing to die together rather than live apart. It wasn't logical. It wasn't rational. It was pure, stubborn, beautiful insanity. The Vraxian fleet began its final approach. 28 ships remained, all of them converging on the crippled Defiant. The other 2 human vessels, the cruiser Horizon and the frigate Valiant, moved to intercept. They were trying to buy time, trying to give the Defiant's escape pods a chance to reach the colony. It was a noble gesture and a useless one. The Vraxians had more than enough ships to destroy everything. Then something happened that Kelleth didn't expect. The humans stopped fighting like soldiers and started fighting like cornered animals. Corporal Nina Ward found herself trapped in a sealed section of the Defiant with 3 other Marines. Vraxian boarding parties had cut off their escape routes. They had limited ammunition and no way to call for help. Ward's commanding officer would have expected her to find a defensible position and hold out as long as possible. Ward had a different idea. She gathered her team and explained her plan. Kelleth watched through the security cameras, his translator converting her words. The plan was insane, even by human standards. They were going to make bombs out of the fuel cells that powered their equipment. Then they were going to set a trap in the corridor where the Vraxians would have to pass. The other Marines stared at Ward for a moment. Then one by one they nodded. They began pulling apart their gear, extracting the fuel cells, rigging them with detonators made from spare parts and desperate hope. It took them 15 minutes to set up the trap. They had maybe 30 seconds before the Vraxians arrived. Ward positioned her team in a side corridor. When the Vraxian boarding party rounded the corner, she triggered the homemade bombs. The explosion tore through the corridor, killing a dozen Vraxians instantly. The blast wave knocked Ward and her Marines off their feet, but they survived. They grabbed weapons from the dead Vraxians and kept moving, kept fighting, kept refusing to die. In the Defiance medbay, Karen Mills was dealing with her own crisis. 15 wounded soldiers lay on beds and floors, too injured to evacuate. The ship's medical systems were failing. She had limited supplies and no backup. When a hull breach began to form in the wall next to the medbay, Mills made a choice that Kelleth knew would haunt him forever. She sealed the breach with emergency foam, but it wouldn't hold for long. The pressure differential would tear the patch apart in minutes, and everyone in the medbay would be sucked out into space. Mills could evacuate through the emergency hatch, save herself, and leave the wounded behind. She looked at the soldiers on their beds, looked at the emergency hatch, and made her decision. She welded the emergency hatch shut from the inside. Kelleth's sensors picked up her vital signs, her heart rate, her breathing. She was afraid. Of course she was afraid. But she stayed anyway, working frantically to stabilize her patients, to give them every possible second of life. When the patch finally failed, she would die with them. She knew this. She did it anyway. Colonel Frank Hayes commanded the remaining Marine units aboard the Defiant. When the Vraxian boarding parties overran an entire deck, Hayes found himself with 20 Marines and no weapons. The armory on that deck had been destroyed in the initial attack. The colonel looked at his troops, looked at the maintenance lockers lining the corridor, and started laughing. "All right, people," he said, pulling a plasma cutter from one of the lockers. "Time to get creative." The Marines armed themselves with whatever they could find. Plasma cutters, welding torches, hydraulic pry bars, heavy wrenches. Tools that were never meant to be weapons became weapons in human hands. Hayes led his improvised army against the Vraxian boarders, and Kelleth watched in amazement as they won. The Vraxians had armor and blades and natural weapons. The humans had tools and desperation and a complete unwillingness to accept defeat. Hayes used a plasma cutter to slice through a Vraxian warrior's armor. A Marine named Eric Stone killed an enemy soldier with a wrench to the head. Another Marine, Julie Wong, used a welding torch like a flamethrower, driving the Vraxians back through sheer aggression. It shouldn't have worked. By every law of combat that Kelleth knew, the humans should have been slaughtered, but they weren't, because the Vraxians, for all their advantages, had never fought an enemy that simply refused to die. The psychological impact was devastating. The Vraxian boarding parties began to hesitate, to second-guess, to fear what these crazy humans would do next. Outside the ship, the space battle reached its peak. Lieutenant Amy Price, still commanding the Relentless, had pushed her destroyer far beyond its limits. The ship was barely holding together, but Price kept it in the fight. She used her failing shields as a battering ram, smashing through Vraxian formations. She fired her weapons even as they overheated and began to melt. When her targeting systems failed, she aimed manually, relying on instinct and experience. Commander Rachel Stone commanded the Valiant, the last frigate still fighting. Her ship was faster than the others, and she used that speed to dance through the Vraxian fleet like a ghost. Stone's tactics were hit and run, striking from unexpected angles and disappearing before the enemy could respond. She was buying time, precious seconds for the escape pods to reach safety. But time was running out. The Defiance reactor was reaching critical levels. Captain Morrison stood on his bridge, watching the readings climb higher and higher. He knew what would happen next. He had always known how this would end. "All ships, this is Morrison," he said quietly. "It has been an honor serving with you." Kelleth leaned forward in his observation chair, his eyes fixed on the screens. He knew that tone. He had heard it before from 100 different species in 100 different languages. It was the voice of someone who had accepted death and found peace with it. Morrison turned to the skeleton crew that had refused to evacuate. They stood at their stations, battered and bloody but unbowed. The captain smiled at them, and Kelleth saw something in that smile that made his ancient heart ache. It was pride. Pure, simple pride in the people he led. "Ready the final approach," Morrison ordered. "Let's make this count." The battlefield was quiet now. Kelleth sat in his observation chair, surrounded by screens filled with wreckage and corpses. The silent witness drifted through the debris field, its sensors cataloging the aftermath of the most brutal battle the observer had ever witnessed. His hands shook as he began compiling his report for the Galactic Council. He didn't know where to start. How could he explain what he had seen? How could he make the Council understand that everything they thought they knew about warfare was wrong? The humans had broken every rule, violated every principle of military doctrine, and somehow turned defeat into victory, through nothing but raw determination and a complete disregard for their own survival. Commander Rachel Stone's voice crackled across the communication channels. She was transmitting to Earth, to the government that had sent these people to fight and die in the cold darkness of space. Her message was brief and to the point. This is Commander Stone of the Valiant to Earth Command. Mission accomplished. The colony is secure. We held the line. Her voice carried exhaustion and grief, but also unmistakable pride. Captain Morrison and the Defiant were lost. The horizon went dark. Casualties are severe. But we won. Kelleth listened to the transmission and felt something break inside his chest. That was it. No dramatic speeches. No military jargon. Just a simple statement of fact from a woman who had watched her friends die and somehow found the strength to keep fighting. The humans treated this nightmare as just another day's work. The Galactic Council responded to Stone's transmission with an offer to send rescue ships. Stone accepted gratefully. The Valiant was barely functional, and the surviving crew needed medical attention that the ship's damaged facilities couldn't provide. But before the rescue ships arrived, Kelleth made a decision that surprised him. He requested permission to board the Valiant and interview the survivors. The Council granted his request but warned him that direct contact with humans might be psychologically damaging. They were right. He knew they were right. He went anyway because he needed to understand. After 300 years of watching war from a safe distance, he needed to look these people in the eyes and ask them why. The Valiant's docking bay was a disaster. Scorch marks covered the walls. Emergency foam sealed dozens of breaches. Bodies lay covered by sheets waiting for proper burial. Stone met Kelleth at the airlock, her uniform torn and stained with blood that might have been hers or someone else's. Her eyes were red from crying or smoke or both. "Observer Kelleth," she said, extending a hand in the human greeting. "Thank you for coming." He took her hand carefully, mindful of the cultural differences between their species. Her grip was firm despite the exhaustion evident in every line of her body. He followed her through the damaged corridors, past crew members who sat against walls in stunned silence or worked frantically to repair critical systems. They reached what passed for a conference room on the battered ship. Stone collapsed into a chair and gestured for Kelleth to sit across from her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The observer looked at this human woman, this survivor of the impossible, and struggled to find the right words. "I have documented wars across more than 100 worlds," Kelleth finally said. "I have watched civilizations rise and fall. I have seen every form of combat that exists in the galaxy. What your species did today should not have been possible." Stone laughed, a bitter sound without humor. "Tell me about it." "I still can't believe we're alive." "That's not what I meant," Kelleth said quietly. "You fought in ways that violate every principle of self-preservation. You sacrificed yourselves without hesitation." Commander Lisa Banks turned her failing ship into a weapon. Engineer Pete Collins held a burning plasma conduit with his bare hands. Captain Morrison flew his ship into the enemy formation knowing he would die. He paused, his voice shaking. "How can your species sustain such losses? How can you continue when death is certain?" Stone was quiet for a long time. She looked at her hands, at the scars and burns that covered them. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but steady. "You're asking the wrong question, observer. You want to know how we can fight when we know we'll die. The real question is how we could live with ourselves if we didn't fight. Those people on the colony below, they're counting on us. Their families and children and people who just want to build a life in peace. We didn't fight because we weren't afraid of death. We fought because there are things more important than our own survival." Kelleth felt his world shift. In 300 years, he had never heard anyone say that. Most species fought to survive. They retreated when the odds were bad. They surrendered when defeat was certain. They valued their own lives above everything else because that was logical, reasonable, sane. The humans didn't care about logic or reason or sanity. They cared about each other. Captain Morrison could have retreated, Kelleth said. You all could have left and returned with reinforcements. That would have been the logical choice. Logical for who? Stone asked. The colony had maybe 2 days before the Vraxians attacked them. We didn't have time to get reinforcements. It was us or nobody. And we don't abandon our people. We don't leave them to die alone. That's not who we are. She stood and walked to a damaged viewport. Below them, the colony world turned slowly in space. Lights flickered on the night side. The homes and streets where thousands of humans lived and worked and dreamed of tomorrow. Do you see that? Stone said, pointing at the planet. My sister lives down there. She moved to the colony 3 years ago with her husband and 2 kids. Amy Price, the one who rammed her destroyer into a Vraxian cruiser. Her parents retired to that world. Danny Cross, the Marine who led the boarding parties, his fiancée teaches at the colony school. She turned to face Kelleth. We weren't fighting for abstract principles or government orders. We were fighting for people we love. And yeah, we died doing it, but they're safe now. That's what matters. Kelleth had no response to that. He had spent centuries studying the art of war, as if it was something separate from the people who fought. He had reduced battles to statistics, victories to numbers, deaths to data points. The humans had shown him the truth. War wasn't about tactics or technology or superior numbers. It was about why you fought. And people who fought for love were capable of impossible things. Over the next few hours, Kelleth interviewed other survivors. Corporal Tyler Jackson, who had killed the Vraxian admiral with a knife, told him about the Marines who had died protecting his advance. Medical officer Karen Mills, who had survived when the patch on her medbay held longer than expected, cried as she described the patients she couldn't save. Engineer Pete Collins, his hands wrapped in bandages, smiled and said he'd do it again without hesitation. Every person Kelleth spoke to had lost friends, lost loved ones, lost pieces of themselves in that battle. But not one of them expressed regret. They mourned their dead with tears and grief and pain, but they also honored them by surviving, by continuing, by making sure those sacrifices meant something. When Kelleth returned to the Silent Witness, he began writing his report. It took him 3 days. He wrote and deleted and rewrote, trying to capture the truth of what he had witnessed. The final version was unlike anything he had ever submitted to the council. He described the tactics in detail but also explained the motivation behind them. He documented the casualties but told the stories of the people who died. He analyzed the battle's outcome but warned the council that humanity's true strength wasn't their weapons or ships. It was their absolute refusal to abandon each other, even when doing so would save their own lives. His final paragraph was simple and direct. The Galactic Council should never underestimate humanity. More importantly, they should never make an enemy of a species that fought like this when defending others, because humans protecting their own would be absolutely unstoppable. The Council read his report in shocked silence. Then they distributed it to every member species, along with the unedited footage from Kelleth's cameras. The images of Lisa Banks's sacrifice, Collins's burning hands, Morrison's final charge. They spread across the galaxy like wildfire. Within weeks, every civilization knew about the humans and their impossible victory. The Vraxian horde never attacked human territory again. When other aggressive species considered testing humanity's defenses, they watched Kelleth's footage and reconsidered. The humans had earned something more valuable than respect. They had earned fear. Back on Earth, the survivors were welcomed as heroes. Massive memorials were built for the fallen. Captain Morrison's name became legendary. Children learned about the Battle of New Haven in school, studied the tactics, memorized the names of the dead. Stone and the other survivors tried to return to normal life, but they were changed forever by what they had witnessed and done. As for Kelleth, he submitted his resignation to the Galactic Council and returned to his homeworld. After 300 years of observing war, he was done. He had seen something that broke him in ways he couldn't explain. Not the violence itself, though, that was terrible enough. What broke him was understanding what the humans understood. That love could be stronger than fear. That people would endure anything for those they cared about. That survival wasn't the most important thing in the universe.